Farage is doing, because he still enjoys that marvelous freedom of opposition, you can be all things to all people. So you can say, yes, we're going to limit immigration to the extent we can now debate, but at the same time, we believe that dear old age pensioners, should be able to warm their toes comfortably in winter, that people should have as many children as they like on the state. All of this stuff, you can play this game. Now, I don't think they should be doing. I think that it will be catastrophic if they go down that route.
I want to start by talking about the small boats crisis. Now, this is in the news today because there might be a deal between the British and the French. But let's start on the invasion itself. Is there any parallel in British history where hundreds of thousands of men, fighting-age men, have made it across the English Channel in a kind of invasion on these boats before?
Are you suggesting we're to compare it directly with the Norman conquest? Because, of course, as part of the deal with France, the Bayeux Tapestry is due to come back to the British Museum. Yes, there have been invasions, but they were a very long time ago. There's a wonderful story told of Winston Churchill and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, at the time of the abdication crisis, when she was only Duchess of York. And Churchill said, the struggle to replace the elder brother, Edward VIII, with the younger brother, her husband, reminded him of the Wars of the Roses. The Queen Mother, as she then was, a young woman, but still with that style that she had later on, she looked at Mr. Churchill very hard and she said, "Mr. Churchill, that was a very long time ago." And this whole argument about Britain being a nation of immigrants is simply rubbish. There were waves of invasion, waves of conquest 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago. There is nothing similar whatever in and between. In other words, you have a largely stable population. The evidence suggests that for a very large part of the demographic of people in England, in fact, it goes back beyond the Romans, it goes back beyond the Anglo-Saxon invasions, back beyond the Norman invasions, to the Brittonic people, as they're called. In other words, those who've been here since the Stone Age. So we are dealing with an entire myth. And it is one of the profound problems that we are dealing with government by myth. Now, myth, Stephen, is a wonderfully polite word. Another word is propaganda. And there's a wonderful definition of propaganda by one of the greatest scholars of my old university that spat me out at Cambridge, a man called F.M. Cornford, Francis Cornford, one of the greatest classicists, the editor of key works of Plato, Aristotle, and so on. And he wrote a famous book of the analysis of academic politics, rejoicing in the wonderful title of the Microcosmographia Academica, with, it's an extended joke on the subject of academic politics, but with brilliant observation. He was in the First World War. He was called up into the civil service, where he sharpened his claws, and he became familiar with propaganda. And when the Microcosmographia was republished in the early 1920s, there was a new preface which described his experience of central politics as opposed to university politics. And it contains this immortal phrase, propaganda, or a branch of the art of lying. We've had government by lies. Government by lies in every department you can think of, net zero, the wonderful benefits of a multicultural society, the amazing fact that apparently we can get energy from windmills. Of course you can, but all these things, the idea that they can be done at zero cost. This is a government by lies. And it is, the problem is, you see, Stephen, there is a great precedent for this. Do you remember Tom Holland, called a historian, but in fact a rather sophisticated novelist, came up at the first time that we had the dispute about another one of these consequences of a mass invasion of young men with very different mores from our own, that's to say the rape gangs. And he said 10 years ago, endeavouring to shut up the debate. You will remember another Labour MP said, "Shut up in the name of diversity." He said it was a noble aim to preserve multiculturalism. Now, this is going right back to Plato. Plato's society of deliberate inequality, run by what? Run by leaders who call themselves philosopher kings, the government of experts, which is so characteristic of the Starmer world, the world of New Labour, the world of Tony Blair. It was held together by a noble lie. The lie that people came like different metals. The high intellectual governing class were the people of gold. The mere soldiers, those who defended it, the Metropolitan Police with their fat tummies and their pride badges, they were people of bronze. And the ordinary folk who embraced not simply the peasants, but the merchant class, they were the people of iron, to be despised. So there was a rank according to preciousness, according to value. And unfortunately, we've had something like this. We've had a deliberate purveyance of lies. And the other aspect of this, Stephen, again, another very obvious lie, is transgenderism. One of the ways this is enforced, because they are in a direct contradiction with truth, we have to do what was done to me. We have to limit freedom of speech. We have to punish people if, like the little boy with the naked emperor, they say the emperor's got no clothes. They must be punished. They must be silenced. And one of the things that's happening, of course, is more and more, there are more and more little boys. There are more and more people looking at this naked parade. I mean, the parade in Windsor, has there ever been anything more fatuous? They may be wearing robes of state, red sashes, tiaras, but they're naked, absolutely naked.
You talk about lies and myths. One of the most fascinating moments, I think, recently from a Labour minister was on Question Time when he was asked about the small boats crisis, and he said that most of the people who are coming are women and children.
Darren Jones, in direct conflict with visual evidence. Again, George Orwell makes this absolutely clear. The authoritarian state insists you pretend that 2 + 2 = 5. At every level. Again, the whole way in which the economy is mismanaged. The idea you can tax your way to growth. This mysterious thing called stability, which means freezing the economy on the wrong course. The idea that merely incantating the word growth, saying, we want growth, we want growth, we want growth. It's the economics of the rain dance. But there's this extraordinary thing on the left. It's the belief in the magic of words. And at every single stage for the last 40, 50 years, we've been governed essentially by magic. But of course, you run out of magic in the same way that you run out of money. It is mythical. And sorry, myths aren't true. There's an even more extraordinary point, Stephen. I don't know whether you know it. If you look at the Human Rights Act, it protects belief on the analogy of religious belief. All it protects are beliefs founded on unreason. You cannot have a protected belief that's founded on reason and fact and is therefore susceptible to change. You have to believe in transubstantiation, transgenderism, J.D. Nice. We're in a world in which we've stood things completely on their head.
I want to bring us back to the small boats, and this links in with your answer.
But what I was trying to do, I was trying to get, Stephen, just so that we underline that was not a diversion, our conversation. It's really important we get this. That the small boats, yes, is an acute example of this, but it's an example of a hugely broader question. So long as we understand that I wasn't just going off onto an abstract academic disquisition.
Yeah, I wasn't accusing you of that. I'm just saying, just very specifically on the small boats issue, it's interesting if you look back from a historical perspective, and again, this actually links in with a lot of what you're saying. So Britain historically hasn't really been invaded. Obviously, we had the Normans, that was around 10,000 people. The small boats, we're looking at hundreds of thousands. We're looking at maybe 200,000, up to 200,000 people, largely from Asia and Africa, largely young fighting age males, who are coming in and being offered luxury hotels on the taxpayer.
Luxury, no, not luxury. They're being offered let's not give gifts to our enemies. They are being given mid-ranking hotel accommodation.
Okay,
Nevertheless,
I agree. It's more nuanced than saying it's all luxury, but certainly I've seen examples of, for example, a four-star hotel in Chichester. It's absolutely beautiful. I've been to a hotel up north in Crewe where, incredible hotel, that's, I would say, approaching luxury. But anyway, that's just semantics. My question really is this. Henry VIII and other British monarchs and leaders have been able to fight off invasions for 1,000 years using the Royal Navy and the fact that we're an island. You know, you can look at Trafalgar, you can look at the Battle for Britain. But why can't we, in 2025, deal with the small boats crisis when Britain historically has been very able to fight off these kind of invasions? And I think part of the answer is, you talked about the Human Rights Act there, this obsession with international law. So international law has been able to essentially break the British monopoly on not being invaded for over 1,000 years.
I'm not sure it's really the international law in this case. It is certainly human rights law. I think what we've got to understand is that human rights law is fundamentally destructive. And the problem is, of course, it sounds so lovely, doesn't it? You know, it's cuddly, it's warm, it's a Paddington Bear idea. You know, little pork pie hat, a little luggage label saying Peru round the neck, the battered little suitcase. It's this whole invocation of compassion. But the idea of European or international declarations of human rights, think about what it means. It means you were talking about the defending of a nation. You were talking about a nation with borders, right? Human rights law does not derive its authority from the nation state or the representative assembly of the nation state. It is deliberately pitched above it. And what we've done, we've invented a notion, it's a complete invention, that there is a superior form of law. There is the mere law, which you and I participate in the making of via our representatives in Parliament, the law of statute, as it were, the interpretation of statute through our judges. But above it, there is this new universal thing called human rights. Now, again, it's really interesting to tease out in two different directions from that. The first thing is to look at why this idea came in. The idea of this kind of human rights is invented. It's got a pair of inventors in the 17th century. Like most things, it's invented here in England. Its key inventor is a political philosopher called John Locke. And he comes up with this idea, except his rights are very limited. They're life, liberty, and property. And he says if the state fails to protect those, the citizens may rise up and overthrow the government. So it was from the very beginning destructive. Its view was it enabled you to overthrow government in the name of higher principles. It was that same idea was then used 100 years later by the American colonists when they'd run out of good arguments against the British government, which was only trying to recoup a tiny proportion of the amount of money that it had spent on the 6 years war, the 7 years war in France, the one that actually enables America to exist, because you defeat both the French in Canada and in the South and the American Indians who were their allies. But the Americans didn't want to pay that. They wanted self-government. So what did they do? They invoke in the Declaration of Independence universal human rights. So universal human rights have always been about overthrowing things, which is why, again, they figure so largely in that period of terrible universal overthrow of the French Revolution. Now, that's one side of them. They're destructive. They're destructive. As we've seen, they're destructive of our own law. They've been uniquely destructive of our own law. There's another aspect to them. Think about what it means. If you say there's a thing called European, or still worse, universal human rights, you mean there's a universal human being, that we're all fundamentally the same. You've been being very disparaging, Mr. Edgington, about those unfortunates seeking to cross the Channel. You have said they come from Africa and from various places in Asia. But Mr. Edgington, they're just like you and me. They are potentially Welsh choir boys. You've been talking about frontiers, Mr. Edgington. Frontiers are a wicked construct of the nation state. We are one human family. We belong to each other. Do you see what I mean? And can I just remind you of something that was said at Windsor? Something so crass, so foolish, despite the fact that it was uttered by a king at a state banquet. There are no borders between England and France. Can you imagine a statement of such transcendental folly? And the royal household told us that speech had been reviewed by Downing Street, but you will remember this is the Downing Street which places in front of the Prime Minister a rather interesting speech which says that we risk becoming an island of strangers, and the Prime Minister reads it out, apparently with never having read the words before, not having understood them, being profoundly, so deeply shocked when he was reminded a few weeks later by his left-wing MPs this was terrible and reminded them all of Enoch Powell. What are we doing? What are we? But again, you know, there's what happened. What I found what happened in Windsor utterly shocking. Do you remember where the state banquet took place? St. George's Hall, the Hall of the Garter, the Hall of the Order of Chivalry, that is founded to commemorate and celebrate the English invasions of France in the Middle Ages, that ultimate act of defiance. And there we celebrate, essentially, surrender. The same thing with the speech of the French president to Parliament. It took place in the Royal Gallery, with Trafalgar on one side and Waterloo on the other. The descent, the failure of our politics in comparison with theirs.
We will get on to the Anglo-French relations in a moment, but I do want to pick up on something you said about the universality of human rights and the idea that everyone is equal and therefore everyone has an equal right to come to Britain. We don't have borders. We have to be compassionate.
The equal rights at law. The equal rights at law, yeah.
So this comes from an argument of morality, but the ironic thing is that they claim that they are the people with the moral high ground. I'm talking about the left here, the establishment, the conservatives who want to support, this human rights. But what actually happens, the actual result of allowing these illegal people to come into Britain is a lot of crime, including the murder of Thomas Roberts, a 21-year-old Royal Marine, who was stabbed in 2021 in the heart by an illegal migrant who came into Britain in 2018. So they seem to have compassion for everyone other than the native British population. How do they square this in their warped morality and their warped view of the world, where they're just ignoring the rights of British people to be safe, to have their own country, versus the rights of random people from Africa?
Everybody else. Well, there are two ways this is done, Stephen. One is, so you referred to it as morality. The reason that it's so profoundly dangerous is that it's actually embedded in our law. Everybody goes on about Robert Jenrick has been particularly eloquent on this, two-tier justice, but it is actually embodied in law, in this human rights law we talk about. Or rather, it's embodied in something, again, we need to talk about, a particular tradition of legal interpretation of this that's developed, especially since the 1990s. It's associated with one man, a man called Tom Bingham, who was the last senior law lord. That is, he would have been the equivalent of the president of the Supreme Court, and he desperately wanted to be, but the Supreme Court was yet to be invented. And he is the one who does two things. He argues passionately in a very famous book, which again was purely his view, but has become legal gospel, that human rights law, and something you mentioned right at the beginning, international law, is a fundamental part of the common law of England and has equal status, or if not greater status, than parliamentary statute. And this seems to me to be the beginning of everything that's gone wrong. It's his arguments, Bingham's arguments, which are picked up by the Attorney General, by Richard Hermer, and presented as gospel. In fact, there's a slow groundswell. Lawyers are very collegiate. They don't much like disagreeing in public on this kind of thing. But the views of Bingham and the crude, and Bingham was able, Hermer is just a hack, the crudity of his statements is actually bringing great lawyers out of the closet. People like Lord Wolston, who was actually his predecessor as a Conservative Attorney General, saying these are unusually extreme views of law. They don't belong to the mainstream of legal interpretation. But let me give you a perfect illustration addressing all of these things of what Bingham says is the purpose of human rights law. Remember, at the beginning, when the Declaration was first drawn up in the 1940s and ratified by Britain in 1951, under a Labour government, by the way, that was very reluctant to ratify it because it saw all the problems that were going to arise. As a brilliant piece by Peter Lilly explaining why it shouldn't have done. But as usual, they felt they would lose international face if they didn't ratify it. To begin with, the human rights legislation was designed with the Nazis in mind to protect the individual against the state. Then there is this mysterious alchemy as the decades go on, largely under the influence of developments in continental Europe, where the protection of the rights of the majority against the state somehow became the protection of the rights of minorities against the majority. And the key moment in all the output of Lord Bingham was a lecture in Australia in 2007, just after he'd written and published his book on the rule of law. And I'm going to quote the paragraph. I've now memorized it. It's so extraordinary. He says, human rights law, by definition, is anti-democratic insofar as it is counter-majoritarian. It exists to protect minorities against the majority, who will deny them political rights, therefore they have to be given judicial rights. And then he goes on and he lists these specially protected minorities. The mentally sick, the asylum seeker, those belonging to foreign and hostile religions, the Roma. If you want to look at the entire list of scandals of the misapplication of the law against the national interest, it's in that list. And then there's another thing. The law intersects with fashionable sociological theory. The idea of white guilt. The idea that there is indeed a hierarchy of racial value in the world, but it's the opposite of apartheid South Africa. Whites come at the bottom because we've oppressed everybody else. And there is a hierarchy of victimhood. And it may include the Irish, because allegedly the British were terribly wicked to them. There's that wonderful phrase of my dear friend Ruth Dudley Edwards, the competition to be MOPE, M-O-P-E, most oppressed people ever. And you can see this as how this hierarchy develops. And at the moment, the top of the hierarchy, back in 2020, at the time of BLM, the top hierarchy was the black. We were having Black Lives Matter, with the extraordinary politicization of a single conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, it has become the Palestinians. Hence the fact that all the fashionable goons headed by Greta Thunberg and people like that are now parading every whatever. So what you have then is a new hierarchy of value. It is, of course, as iniquitous and as outrageous as the apartheid that it so much resembles. It denies fundamental human equality. It does all sorts of things. You remember, the left on the one hand says race is artificial, of no significance, and yet on the other hand, it turns it into the central protected human characteristic, the whole notion of the protected characteristics in the Human Rights Act. So there's this extraordinary ambiguity about it. But it's also, the left claims to believe in equality. It is fundamentally anti-equality. The proper form of equality is the traditional British view. You're all equal before the law. No, we are not. There is you can see all of these things fit together. The whole dispute, you will remember, with the Sentencing Council, which said that pre-trial reports must be sought for immigrant groups and those, especially of things like unusual religion, in every case, making a reduced sentence likely. And this is done deliberately. This is a part of the deliberate devaluation, and let me use the missing word in your phrases, the native white population. In other words, we have a government which has turned against its own people. And it's not simply turned against its own people at home, it's turned against its own people abroad. The Attorney General's worship, again, of this Binghamite heresy, of the incorporation of international law, leads to the notion we have no national interest. That our only national interest is obeying international law. So not only do we give away the Chagos Islands, we pay the buggers billions to take them from us. There's an insanity about this. Of course, the next step is reparations for slavery. This is a government which is open to every variety of this idiot, cranky, polytechnic nonsense. It's a government of bad university lecturers, of failed sociology students, of charity chiefs. Not a single one of them has a sense that anything has to be deserved, earned, or paid for.
But of course, we do earn a lot of so-called moral clout on the world stage.
Oh, my dear, do we? But you know, we are a state, we're not a church. And this, again, is something we really do need to address. We need to address it in terms of domestic policy. Everybody goes on about our obligations to the sick, to the ill, to the disabled. You know, I happen to have been born with club feet. I'm fully aware of these issues. But do you know what? The state is not a charity. The state is not bounded by Christian morality. If you actually look, and the right is as foolish on this point as the left. If you look in the Bible, easier for a rich man to pass through the eye of a needle than to enter the kingdom of heaven. Sell all thy goods and give to the poor. Fat lot of use that is if you're trying to run a state. But again, what we've done, I've said this before, every time I hear the word compassion, I want to reach for a revolver. We need a nasty party. Theresa May said we shouldn't be one. You cannot afford universal benevolence. Now, look, if individuals, let me be quite clear, if an individual like Bill Gates decides that he wants to give away large sums of money, that's entirely his responsibility. It is not his responsibility to tell states to behave like this. Again, we've confused morality with public policy. There's again this whole notion of attributing value to companies. It's simply preposterous. You know, the idea that your ice cream has got moral values, Ben and Jerry's, and this kind of nonsense. There is a refusal to accept that this. Again, it's very much, I think, so much of this goes back to the consequences of so-called fighting the moral war against the Nazis. So you try to imbue the state with a particular kind of morality. I think it's it's a profound error. And the old view of the pursuit of national interest, of a degree of decency and whatever, that's enough. The whole inane under the Conservatives, under Cameron, the whole Andrew Mitchell, the inane prioritization of international aid as a kind of symbol of moral virtue, disastrous. And of course, the evidence is overwhelming. There's that wonderful remark of one of my fellow professors at LSE decades ago, Professor Bauer, that international aid is the taking of money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. It's an absurdity. International aid has made no difference whatever. The countries that have modernized have done it. They pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, like China, like Japan. The countries that have had aid thrown at them by the bucket load usually sink ever deeper into a mire of poverty and disease.
You talk about the origin of a lot of bad ideas, particularly coming from the Second World War, but also the 1990s, the post-war period, where we created the European Court of Human Rights and so on, which, by the way, I have to say, didn't apply to Britain until the late 60s. This is something I learned recently. Even when Attlee and Churchill were coming up with this legislation, it was only applicable to the continent. Both Labour and the Conservatives were insistent that Britain had an exception.
Why were they insisting? Because we already practiced this. The original, again, it's this terrible misunderstanding. The original purpose of the convention was to act as a how to do it to countries that had newly escaped from the tyranny of the Nazis and later on the tyranny of the communists. It was never intended to be person-to-person law. And this is the disaster. And when what Attlee and what Attlee's government said in 1951, when to their horror they looked at the text, they said this is the worst drafted text we've ever seen. They said any lawyer can make it mean whatever he wants, that it flies at several points against the fundamental principles of English law, but we're going to sign it because otherwise we would look bad. And this is the absolute, it's the repeated disaster. It was the Foreign Office, it's always the Foreign Office. You remember the joke, the Foreign Office is to represent foreigners in Whitehall. And it never fails in its job. That extraordinary letter signed by multitudinous ambassadors recently about recognizing Palestine. Just extraordinary. It exists. Our entire diplomatic service now, with one or two very honourable exceptions, exists to represent the foreigner. Gus O'Donnell, the cabinet secretary under New Labour, said that the purpose of British government is not to develop the interests of Britain, it is to develop the greater interest of the world. Do you see what I mean? There's a complete despising, and this is they call them mandarins. That's to say, the elite governing class of China. It's very, very similar. They got there by passing an awful lot of examinations. And once they were there, they were draped in robes of silk. They grew their fingernails exceedingly long. They were carried around in palanquins, and they governed the mere peasants according to the higher law. And the resemblances are terrifying there. These are people who simply assume that the people of iron, those at the bottom of the pile, they're, of course, the men of gold at the top. The people at the bottom simply exist to provide the money to fulfill their sense of right. And we now have a state, and an entire state machinery, because, of course, the Labour Party is the party of the blob. The Labour Party is the party of these quangos, of these charities, of the whole world. The Labour Party is the party of the blob, and we've now found ourselves in a position where the blob is trying to govern the blob and there's an awful sense that it's all going round in circles, but it is this terrible sense that it has become what everybody outside the blob is seeing. It's become parasitic. The government is now simply parasitic on the productive sector, and it applies the enormous proportion of national wealth that it's taking, at 1/3 and rising very rapidly towards 40%. It applies it to functions and purposes which overwhelmingly do not command popular assent. Again, it's this strange, it's this extraordinary. The left, claims to believe in democracy, in the popular vote. In fact, it's utterly, directly elitist, which is why, of course, it's got to denounce people like Nigel Farage or Robert Jenrick or Rupert Lowe as being populist, this new wicked term. I mean, who would have thought that a party of the left would denounce people who listen to popular opinion? It is this, again, I know about you, and there is this notion of stepping through the looking glass in Lewis Carroll. I think we're in a slightly different world. We're in a world in which things have that wonderful medieval phrase turned upside down.
Again, you talk about ideas, you talk about the origin of bad ideas, and one thing that I'm surprised that you haven't mentioned, and this is your famous catchphrase, is that all bad ideas come from France. So we talked earlier about Anglo-French relations. Obviously, during the Tudor period and before that with the 100 Years' War, our relationship wasn't brilliant, to say the least. Obviously, Henry VIII had this amazing Field of the Cloth of Gold. Perhaps you can talk a bit about that. And later
I think it was like the Windsor Summit.
That's a great comparison.
It's exactly like the Windsor Summit.
Well, let you talk about that, but let me just quickly finish the question. So we've had a long antagonist history, including the Napoleonic Wars, and ever really since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, we didn't go to war. We've had a long period of peace now since 1815. In 1904, we had the Entente Cordiale. Now, this, I think, was probably a major mistake, which brought us really into the First World War, defending France against Germany. And as we know, the First World War it was probably one of the worst events ever to happen in English or British history. And then today we've got Macron coming to England, coming to Britain, telling us that we voted the wrong way in the Brexit referendum, telling us that we should rejoin the European Union, lecturing us, and then we've got, like you said earlier, King Charles saying there shouldn't be any borders between Britain and France. The only time I can think of an example of British history where perhaps this was applicable was Winston Churchill in 1940 saying that we should become one country to fight the Nazis. So can you take us a bit through British or Anglo-French relations and assess this recent state trip from President Macron?
I think you've actually underplayed the importance of Anglo-French relations. Remember, in the Middle Ages, it's different. The great struggle between the English and French crowns in the Middle Ages is a struggle of cousins. That normally in the Middle Ages, remember, there's an extraordinary shift in English history, which takes place with the Norman conquest of 1066. If we like to go back to England when it's conquered by Julius Caesar and then properly conquered later under the Emperor Claudius, from that point onwards, England's relationships look south, across the Channel, across Europe, towards Rome. That connection more or less remains because, of course, of the fact that the Roman Empire, after its fall, is followed by the establishment of the papacy, also in Rome, and enjoying many of the same powers and making many of the same claims as the Roman Empire. But with the Anglo-Saxon invasions and the Danish invasions, both a very long time ago, to recapitulate the Queen Mother, England started to look across the North Sea. But the Norman conquest pulls us back south. But it also creates, effectively, an Anglo-French royal family. And what you're doing, really, in those wars in France is fighting to control a huge cross-channel empire. which comes very, very near to fruition when Henry V, at Agincourt and whatever, defeats the French, marries the French princess, and has a child who, by treaty, is heir to the throne of France. But it's all thrown away because that child, Henry VI, is hopelessly incompetent. The following stage you have, there's an interlude in which England's principal enemy becomes Spain, but from the 17th century onwards, there is, as Churchill in his History of the English-Speaking Peoples most brilliantly describes, there is a centuries-long war between England and France for the domination of the world. It's as simple as that. It's very reminiscent of the struggle between Rome and Carthage. The English are very much aware of the fact, and the English attain this staggering victory in the 7 Years' War, which we've already referred to, of 1756 to 63, and which Churchill correctly describes as the First World War, why the world speaks English. And why, of course, England then rises as this staggering power. Remember, the extraordinary explosion from the end of the 17th century, not simply of power in the sense of the Royal Navy, not simply of trade, but all of it founded on what you've noticed I've been constantly talking about ideas. A revolution in the ideas of mathematics, of Newton, of Locke, of optics, and of the explosion of technology in the production of metal, of textiles, of agriculture, in terms of the rotation of crops. What I call the invention of the modern world. And it arises, Stephen, from a single principal idea. It arises from the idea of evidence, that nature is knowable, that there is such a thing as truth, and that is determined by testing specific evidence. There is then another power, that's the power of France, the defeated power, that depends on a completely different notion, that truth is up there in abstract principle, and everything is derived down from that. So you have a deductive country, a deductive culture and an inductive culture, showing it in its systems of politics, of law, of everything else. And frankly, our catastrophe, Stephen, and I'm using the word catastrophe, is not simply the Entente Cordiale of 1904. It is that particularly after we joined the EU, and more especially after 1997, that our government was deliberately re-engineered on French principles. These principles of universal human rights, of, again, the absurdity of a piece of legislation that's got a one-word title, equality. You will remember liberté, égalité, fraternité. The idea that you try to legislate a single principle, and then you look at the catastrophe of conclusions. Well, that one piece of legislation has bankrupted Birmingham. It's been responsible for the internecine warfare between pretend women and real women. It has profoundly exacerbated race relations. It has led to a disintegration of trust in the workplace. It is imposing intolerable burdens on employees. One single piece of this utterly misconceived legislation. And we need to understand this. This was understood back at, why did we fight the French Revolution? Because then people knew, Castlereagh knew, Wellington knew, the great philosophers, Burke and Bentham, knew that we were fighting a set of ideas that was as profoundly dangerous as communism was. And indeed, communism derives directly from this stuff. We've forgotten this. We've forgotten the importance of ideas. We've forgotten the importance of our own tradition in defending us from this. We're even talking, as the French do, of throwing away jury trial, of relying effectively on simple magistrates. There's been a shocking lack of confidence of our governing class, a realization that they're throwing away. You know, I'm going to say this. The most terrible thing I can ever remember is in Istanbul, Constantinople, standing in the Hippodrome, the remains of the great imperial horse race track, with the twisted remains of the column of the column of Delos, its twisted bronze remains there, and one sense of a superior civilization conquered by an inferior one. We're doing exactly that. Exactly that. All the things that Macron, the insolence of this petty pretend Bourbon, he just needs little red-heeled shoes like Louis XIV. The insolence of this petty Bourbon telling us we were wrong to vote against Brexit, that we're wrong not to have identity cards, that we're wrong not to do everything in the French way. It is insolence, because this is a failed way of doing things. The problem is we now have an elite that thinks this is the right thing to do. Because remember, it's continental Europe that has led the way in the lies, led the way in the suppression of freedom of speech, leads the way, as in Germany, in trying to demonize and actually outlaw political parties that it doesn't like the AfD, or the Front National in France, the whole business again of the turning of law against Marine Le Pen in a completely flagrantly partisan fashion. And yet we are saying we want this. This is what J.D. Vance was about. Do you remember that extraordinary moment in Germany where he told them, you do not believe in democracy and you do not believe in freedom of speech? And Stephen, he's right. We're in this terrible position. It's again, George Orwell foresaw so much. He saw Britain, you remember, it was called Airstrip 1 in 1984, as the border between what is technically called a thalassocracy, that's to say the seaborne powers of Britain and America, and the land powers of Eurasia. And we're again an Airstrip 1 in terms of a battle of ideas. The battle between America, where thanks to not only the First and Second Amendments, but also to the judicial rulings of the 1950s, there is a genuine protection of freedom of speech. And Europe, where it's been decided in the interests of multiculturalism and protecting liberal democracy, that there must be, on the contrary, a deliberate and advancing and ever more radical limitation on freedom of speech. We're at the margins of this. And unfortunately, we have a government which certainly covertly and often openly is entirely in favour of reimposing the French model on Britain. I think this is a state visit in which genuinely, there is a wholesale struggle of ideas. The problem is, France is lovely. I enjoy France. There is the charm of the countryside, the food, the marvelous insolence of the people, a people which, unlike us, gets its own way, because the French love saying no. In English, it's rude to say no. I'm terribly sorry, but I really can't possibly do that. The French just say no, and you win a negotiation like that. You watch Starmer with Macron. He just got him. But people fuss about Donald Trump as representing some sort of fundamental threat. No. It's the world of continental Europe that has been our involvement has been a catastrophe from start to finish.
It's bizarre that we're governed by Francophiles and people obsessed with continental ideas, and they find America particularly vulgar and disgusting because of the Republican Party and Donald Trump. It's not just Donald Trump, but this goes back far beyond him. So I want to move on.
Because again, just quickly, Stephen, remember, America is the direct heir of England at its most glorious epoch. America is the first British Empire. That's what it is, and it acts literally in the course of the 20th century as the successor world state. That's what it is, and if you like, the uniqueness about Britain, Anglo-Britain, or whatever you want to call it, is that even more so than the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire leaves this astonishing legacy of law, of architecture, of ideas, of a great institution, the Roman Church and whatever. But the British Empire leaves this astonishing legacy of successor states, each one coming off from the stem of Britain at a particular historical moment. First America, then Canada, then Australia, New Zealand, and each one echoing and exaggerating the particular political traditions of that moment in Britain. So in Australia, there is no Conservative Party. There is the Conservative Party is called the Liberals, and there's a Labour Party. In America, they, of course, inherited, they had no Tories, but they inherited the Whigs until the Whigs fragmented, and you get the renaming of political parties. In Canada, there was no Labour Party, it was Liberal and Conservative, and so on. But we need to recognise, it seems to me, that there is really a bifurcation in values. The values of the Anglosphere, broadly, and those of the neo-French Napoleonic states of continental Europe. And we have made a series of profound errors. But the most important error is our self-destructiveness. By adopting these, as we said, all bad ideas are French. They're all French, but they're refracted through American academic life. And by adopting these things, we have undercut everything of value in our own culture. So we find ourselves now, Stephen, in a world in which we have sets of values which are simply in conflict with each other. We have what's left of our traditional social attitudes and a traditional law fighting with this foreign import of human rights and international law. We have a structure which traditionally depended on the authority of Parliament, now overlaid by 444 quangos. 1/3 of state expenditure, that is now pushing £400 billion a year, passing through them entirely beyond your control and beyond my control. The revelations in the NHS are beyond belief. And they've now, I don't know whether you saw the report. There was a report on safety in the NHS now, Now that's very important. Do you know how many separate quangos there were responsible for it? 6. Each one producing a different report, each one having a different set of standards. Talk about the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea, these minute differences, ever more numbers of pen pushers, ever more numbers of bureaucrats. The man who saw where we were going is the man who saw where we were going, who saw so much, had this extraordinary level of insight. It was Disraeli. Disraeli reckoned that the Northcote Trevelyan reforms, which established the civil service by entry, by examination and whatever, were in fact laying the foundations of the least desirable form of government, which is bureaucracy. And we tumbled, we had no such thing as a state. You're talking about the First World War. The other great catastrophe of the First World War is we tumble into bureaucracy and we reinforce it hugely in the Second World War. But we did it, of course, without any of the attitudes of distance. Remember, all continental governments, I think, I'm slightly pushing it, but the vast bulk of them were absolute monarchies that rule by means of military power on the one hand and state bureaucracy on the other. So people, of course, develop an appropriate attitude, which is, well, it's the government. If you can get away with it, well, you get away with it. Here we had a fundamentally different approach because you participated in the making of law, you actually obeyed it. It was your job to obey it. And if there was very much less of it than there was in those countries. Similarly, the unthinkable notion in continental Europe of an unarmed police, because they represented the enforcement of that self-made law. And what we've done, of course, now, we've set up the whole of that basis of a high-trust society against the low-trust society. So we're peculiarly defenseless. This, I think, is maybe a point we should stop on, Stephen, but we can throw it open for future discussion. our problem is that because we were this society really essentially characterized by self-government, by the self-administration of law, by high trust, by the fact that we didn't need the thing that Macron was on about, identity cards and whatever. You have the right to exist. The state doesn't give you the right to exist. The problem is, of course, when you admit large numbers of people who have absolutely opposite values, you are peculiarly vulnerable to them. When there's also a betrayal of the native population by the state, the vulnerability rises. So I think, as I said, this state visit that was celebrated with the emptiest of pageantry, the emptiest of gestures, actually was about something very, very serious. And I've been shocked that hardly any of the commentariat really picked up on what's at stake.
You wrote on Twitter or X recently, or you put out a statement, a video, warning Reform, the Reform Party, that they're going too far to the left. And Deputy Leader Richard Tice of Reform replied, "Relax, David, we are the party of common sense and growth, trust us." There was an interview recently with the leader of Reform, Nigel Farage, with the New Statesman, where they're talking about Robert Jenrick, and Farage says that he, i.e. Farage himself, is to the left of the public on immigration, and he believes that Robert Jenrick will outflank him to the right if he becomes leader. Can you comment on, first of all, Richard Tice's response to you, but also on Reform drifting to the left?
The area that I was particularly concerned about was the risk of Reform going in the same way as Peronism in Argentina. So on the one hand, you have a vigorous assertion of nationalism, national identity, and all the rest of it. And on the other hand, leftish policies over taxation, benefits, and all the rest of it. And what, of course, Farage is doing, because he still enjoys that marvelous freedom of opposition, you can be all things to all people. So you can say, yes, we're going to limit immigration to the extent we can now debate, but at the same time, we believe that dear old age pensioners, should be able to warm their toes comfortably in winter, that people should have as many children as they like on the state. All of this stuff, you can play this game. Now, I don't think they should be doing. I think that it will be catastrophic if they go down that route. It is the Argentinian route from which it's taken the extraordinary chainsaw of Milei to begin to rescue Argentina. I think that, remember, one of the points I've been making throughout our discussion has been the importance of hard fact. Another very hard fact is we're going to go bust. We are the most vulnerable of all the leading economies partly because of our absolute refusal to rein in expenditure, particularly welfare expenditure, but also because of the gross mismanagement by the quangos responsible for financial management, by the Bank of England, by, in particular, the Office of Debt Management, which has been uniquely incompetent in the sale of British government debt. Can you imagine, Stephen, at the moment when interest rates are virtually zero, you sell index-linked bonds? The inflation can only go in one direction if it's nearly zero. It can only go up. The naivete, the shock at the utterly, utterly shocking. Now, we've got to break with this. There's got to be an honesty. Because what we're seeing now, Labour was elected on a platform of total lies. It was elected on the platform, you remember, reconfirmed yesterday in Prime Minister's Question Time by Keir Starmer, that Labour will not increase the basic rates of tax, will not increase income tax, will not increase VAT, will not increase national insurance. And then it immediately embarks on a binge of throwing money at its clients, partly in welfare, partly in the state. Look at what's immediately happened. You get the doctors biting the hand, which is just stuffed. Can we have a really, really wonderful mixed metaphor? Biting the hand that has just stuffed their mouths with gold. Because presumably, when you stuff it, your teeth can come in, and doctors clearly have got very, very sharp teeth. Any incoming government that stands a chance of survival has got to break with this. Because what we're seeing now, and what I was trying to get across to Richard, what I've tried to put in person, actually in person to the leadership of Reform, to Nigel, is It's got to be a government founded on honesty. If there's another government, we were talking about lies, promising contradictory things. If reform goes down that path, we are genuinely, and it forms a government or is a dominant element in a government, we are genuinely lost as a country. We are genuinely lost. I remain a member of the Conservative Party. I am very reform friendly because some of them, others, the ex-members like Rupert Lowe, have shown themselves profoundly sympathetic to the arguments that I've been putting forward. Because when we use the metaphor of a broken society, we really are. The Blairite machine of government, this neo-French machine that was created from 1997 and perpetuated by liberal conservatives like Cameron and like Theresa May, has proved itself disastrous. The reason we're in the mess now is because you have a governmental system that's broken. Any incoming party that aspires to govern seriously is going to have to do what Labour, which is the party that created this stuff, that flourishes on it, that feeds on it like a fungus, and it cannot undo it. A serious incoming party will have to, but it will also have to address financial reality. That's my concern.
Okay, so yes, no, or maybe, has Richard Tice persuaded you?
No, I am only persuaded by, he used that word, trust. No political party deserves trust at the moment. We've been lied to and betrayed at every stage. They have to produce evidence. Above all, what they've got to start to do, and this I think is going to be the great challenge of reform, they've got to start to produce realistic, serious, costed policies, which are viable and sustainable and benefit the national interest. Until they do that, why should we trust? And again, reform has been, Nigel Farage has been supremely important as a kind of, not a political party, though of course he's led them, but he's been a kind of Archimedean lever and fulcrum, forcing the Conservative Party, first to be sceptical about Europe, then actually to agree to the Brexit referendum, then finally actually to push it over the line against the wishes of a very large part of the Conservative Party establishment. Now, when you're in that position, you're not a governing party. What you're doing is you're a movement, you're a tendency, even if you call yourself UKIP or whatever else you call yourself. You're engineering a movement of public opinion. They are now in a radically different position. They are, if we believe the opinion polls, more likely than not either to be the next government or the dominant element in it. They've got to behave differently. Nigel has got to behave differently. They've got to be able to show they have real policies. They've got to be able to show that they can work together rather than being almost as divisive as the left. I particularly loved it, by the way, when Zara Sultana announced the formation of a new political party in alliance with Jeremy Corbyn. It split even before it had been formed. There is reform is unfortunately showing, if you remember, every time it gets a new MP, it loses at least another one. I mean, it's like some terrible card game. You can't go on like that. You really cannot go on like that. There has, again, I hesitate to use the word because it's been polluted by Starmer. There has to now to be an element of seriousness. There really does. Not trust, not saying, what is the phrase that the con man always uses? Look at you with wide open eyes, trust me. No.
David Starkey, thank you so much for joining us. Excellent as per usual.